In the winter of 1968, two children walked out of the Appalachian wilderness after being missing for 11 years. They were barefoot. They wore clothes that didn't exist anymore. And when the police asked them where they'd been, they described a house that had burned to the ground in 1959. The town wanted answers. The parents wanted their children back. But what those twins said in the weeks that followed would fracture that family forever, and the evidence, the real evidence, suggested something far worse than a simple kidnapping. This is the story the town of Hollowridge tried to bury. This is what happens when two children come back, but the people who return aren't quite the same ones who left. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Hollowridge Twins, Samuel and Catherine Merrick, disappeared on October 14, 1957. They were 6 years old. It was a Sunday. Their mother, Ann Merrick, had sent them to fetch water from the well behind their property, a routine chore they'd done 100 times before. The well sat about 200 yards from the main house, just beyond a line of oak trees that separated the Merrick property from the deep woods of southern West Virginia. When the children didn't return after 20 minutes, Anne walked out to find them. The bucket was there, tipped over, the rope still tied to the handle, but Samuel and Catherine were gone. There were no footprints leading away, no signs of a struggle, no screaming. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. The search began that evening. Within hours, nearly 80 volunteers from Hollowridge and the surrounding townships combed the woods. They searched for 3 weeks. They found nothing. No clothing, no tracks, no witnesses. By November, the sheriff quietly declared the case cold, though he never said it publicly. The Merrick family held a memorial service in the spring of 1958. Ann Merrick stopped speaking to neighbors. Her husband, Thomas, began drinking, and the town, as towns often do, moved on. But on January 9, 1968, the twins walked out of those same woods, and everything the Merricks thought they understood about the world came apart. They were found by a truck driver named Dale Hutchins, who was hauling timber along Route 19 just after dawn. He saw them standing on the shoulder of the road, two small figures in the fog, and at first he thought they were mannequins. That's what he told the police later. They were too still, too pale. When he stopped and got out, he realized they were children, and they were staring at him with expressions he couldn't quite describe. Not fear, not relief, something else, something empty. He asked them if they were lost. The boy, Samuel, said they were trying to get home. Hutchins asked where home was, and Samuel said the Merrick farm, off Old Ridge Road. Hutchins knew the area. He'd grown up 2 towns over, so he put the children in the cab of his truck and drove them back. When they arrived, Ann Merrick opened the door and collapsed. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just fell to her knees and stared at them like she was seeing ghosts. Because in a way, she was. The children looked almost identical to how they'd looked 11 years earlier. Samuel and Catherine were supposed to be 17 years old, but standing in that doorway, they looked no older than 8 or 9. Their hair was the same length it had been the day they disappeared. Their faces had barely aged. The clothes they wore were handmade, stitched from rough fabric that resembled burlap, and their feet were calloused and scarred, like they'd been walking barefoot for years. Anne brought them inside. She fed them. She bathed them. And then, slowly, she began to ask questions. Where had they been? Who had taken them? How had they survived? Samuel did most of the talking. Catherine barely spoke at all. She just sat in the corner of the room, staring at the wall, her hands folded in her lap. Samuel said they'd been living in a house in the woods. He said a woman had taken them there. He called her the keeper. He said she'd been kind at first, that she'd fed them and given them a place to sleep, but that over time, the house had changed. The rooms got smaller, the windows disappeared, and the keeper stopped looking like a woman. He said she started to look like something else, something that only pretended to be human. Thomas Merrick called the sheriff. By mid-morning, 2 deputies arrived at the house, along with a county doctor named Paul Everett. Dr. Everett examined the twins. He measured their height, checked their teeth, took their temperature. He noted in his report that both children appeared to be suffering from malnutrition and exposure, but that their physical development was inconsistent with their chronological age. They should have been teenagers, but biologically, they were pre-adolescent. He had no explanation for it. The deputies asked the children to describe the house where they'd been kept. Samuel said it was made of stone and wood, that it had 3 rooms and a cellar, and that it sat near a stream about 2 miles west of the Merrick property. He said the keeper had kept them in the cellar most of the time, but that sometimes she let them come upstairs. He said the house smelled like smoke and wet earth. Catherine, when pressed, only nodded. The deputies wrote everything down, and the next morning, they went into the woods to find the house Samuel had described. The search party consisted of 4 deputies, a state trooper, and Thomas Merrick, who insisted on coming despite the sheriff's objections. They followed Samuel's directions, 2 miles west through dense forest, past a dried creek bed, toward a clearing he said he remembered. Samuel had drawn a map the night before, crude but detailed, showing the path he claimed he and Catherine had walked. The map included landmarks: a split oak tree, a rock formation shaped like a tooth, a place where the ground dipped and pooled with rainwater. All of these landmarks existed. The deputies found every single one. But when they reached the clearing where Samuel said the house had been, there was nothing. No structure, no foundation, no stones. The ground was covered in years of undisturbed leaf litter and moss. The trees were old growth, untouched, their roots woven deep into the soil. One of the deputies, a man named Carl Dempsey, later wrote in his personal journal that the site felt wrong, not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. He said the air was too still, that even the birds didn't make noise. But there was no evidence of a house, no evidence that anyone had ever lived there. They expanded the search. They covered a 3-mile radius in every direction. They brought in a cadaver dog from Charleston, thinking maybe the children had been held underground, in some kind of root cellar or bunker. The dog found nothing. They checked county records for old property deeds, thinking maybe there had been a structure there decades ago, long since reclaimed by the forest. There was no record. No home had ever been built in that area. The only thing they found, and this detail was buried in the official report, was a depression in the ground about 30 feet from where Samuel said the house had stood. It was circular, roughly 6 feet in diameter, and filled with ash, old ash, carbon dated later to somewhere between 1950 and 1960. Someone had burned something there, something large, but there was no way to know what. When the deputies returned and told the Merricks what they'd found, or rather, what they hadn't found, Anne asked Samuel to explain. He couldn't. He insisted the house had been there. He said he remembered the door, the windows, the smell of the fire in the hearth. Catherine, sitting beside him, said nothing. She just looked at her hands. Thomas Merrick asked the deputies if they thought the children were lying. The deputies didn't answer, but their silence said enough. Over the next 2 weeks, inconsistencies began to emerge. Small things at first. Samuel said the keeper had cooked for them every night, but when asked what they ate, he couldn't remember. He said there had been a clock on the wall, but he couldn't say what time it showed. He said Catherine had slept in a bed near the window, but Catherine, when asked separately, said she'd slept on the floor. The details didn't align. Dr. Everett conducted a second examination. This time, he brought a colleague, a psychiatrist from Morgantown named Richard Holloway. Holloway spoke with the twins for over 3 hours. His notes, which were later sealed and only released to the family in 1992, painted a disturbing picture. He wrote that both children displayed signs of severe dissociation and possible false memory construction. He noted that Samuel's story changed slightly each time he told it, and that Catherine appeared to be in a state of selective mutism, speaking only when directly prompted, and even then, in fragments. But the most troubling part of Holloway's report wasn't about the children. It was about Anne Merrick. He wrote that during his interviews, Anne had whispered something to him in private. She said that when the children had first come back, she'd noticed something about their eyes. She said they didn't blink the way they used to, that they watched her in a way that made her feel like she was being studied. She asked Holloway if it was possible for children to forget how to be human. Holloway didn't include his answer in the official report. The investigation stalled. The sheriff's department had no leads, no suspects, and no crime scene. The twins were alive, and that should have been enough. But it wasn't. Not for Thomas Merrick. Not for the deputies who'd walked those woods and felt something they couldn't name. And not for the people of Hollowridge, who began to whisper when the Merrick family came into town. Thomas hired a private investigator in March of 1968, a man named Leonard Voss, a former state police detective who'd worked missing persons cases across the Appalachian region. Voss was methodical. He re-interviewed everyone who'd been involved in the original search in 1957. He reviewed the police reports, the witness statements, the search grid maps, and he found something the local deputies had missed. Or perhaps something they'd chosen not to see. 3 days after the twins disappeared in 1957, a woman named Judith Kane reported seeing 2 children matching Samuel and Catherine's description walking along a logging road about 4 miles north of the Merrick property. She said they were with a woman, tall, dark hair, wearing a long coat despite the warm weather. Judith had assumed they were a family passing through, and she hadn't thought to report it until after the search had ended. By then, the sheriff told her it was probably unrelated. The report was filed and forgotten, but Voss found it. And he found something else. The woman Judith described, the woman in the long coat, matched the description of someone the locals had seen before. Her name was Evelyn Marsh. She'd lived in Hollowridge briefly in the early 1950s, renting a small cabin near the edge of town. People remembered her because she didn't talk to anyone. She bought supplies once a week and disappeared back into the hills. In 1954, her cabin burned down. She was presumed dead. No body was ever found. But the fire had been so intense that the authorities assumed she'd been inside when it happened. The case was closed. But Voss discovered something in the county records that no one had connected before. Evelyn Marsh had owned property, a small plot of land 2 miles west of the Merrick farm, the same area where Samuel said the house had been. Voss went back into the woods with a surveyor and a metal detector. They found the property markers, old iron stakes driven into the ground, buried under decades of soil and undergrowth. And they found something else. Beneath the ash pit the deputies had discovered, buried about 3 feet down, they found bones. Not human. Animal. Dozens of them. Small animals. Rabbits, squirrels, birds, all of them arranged in a pattern, circular, deliberate. The bones had been there for years, possibly decades. Voss took photographs, he collected samples, and when he showed Thomas Merrick what he'd found, Thomas asked him what it meant. Voss said he didn't know, but he said it looked like a ritual, like someone had been preparing for something. The local newspaper got wind of the discovery. They published a small article in April of 1968, titled, "Bones Found Near Missing Children Case." The article was brief, vague, and buried on page 7. But it was enough. People started talking. Theories began to circulate. Some said Evelyn Marsh had been a witch, that she'd taken the children for some dark purpose. Others said the twins had been living feral in the woods, that they'd invented the story of the keeper to make sense of trauma they couldn't process. And some, a quieter group, said the children who came back weren't the same children who'd disappeared. That something had taken Samuel and Catherine in 1957, and something else had returned in their place. Anne Merrick stopped leaving the house. She locked the doors at night. She began sleeping in the twins' room, watching them while they slept. Thomas asked her why. She said she needed to make sure they were still breathing. He asked her what she meant. She didn't answer, but in her diary, found years later after her death, she wrote this: "They don't dream. I watch them every night, and they never move. They lie perfectly still, eyes closed, but I don't think they're asleep." If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. By the summer of 1968, the Merrick household had become a prison. Anne barely spoke. Thomas drank himself to sleep most nights, and the twins, Samuel and Catherine, existed in a strange liminal space between childhood and something else entirely. They attended school for 2 weeks before the principal asked Anne to keep them home, not because they were disruptive, but because they unsettled the other children. Samuel would sit at his desk and stare straight ahead for hours without moving. Catherine would draw the same image over and over in her notebook. A door. Always a door. With no handle. The school counselor tried to talk to them. She asked Catherine what the door meant. Catherine looked at her and said, in a voice that sounded too old for her body, that it was the way back. The counselor asked back to where. Catherine didn't answer. She just kept drawing. Samuel was more communicative, but his answers raised more questions than they solved. When asked what he remembered most about being gone, he said the waiting. He said that's what they did most of the time. They waited in the dark. He said the keeper would come down into the cellar once a day, sometimes less, and she would sit with them. She didn't speak. She just watched. And Samuel said that after a while, he and Catherine stopped being afraid. They stopped feeling anything at all. He said it was like forgetting how to be a person, like something inside them went to sleep and never woke up. Dr. Holloway continued his sessions with the twins through the summer. His reports grew increasingly concerned. He noted that both children exhibited what he called flattened affect, a clinical term for emotional numbness. They didn't laugh. They didn't cry. When shown photographs of their family from before they disappeared, they looked at the images as if they were looking at strangers. Holloway tried regression therapy, a controversial technique even then, hoping to unlock suppressed memories. Under light hypnosis, Samuel described the cellar in greater detail. He said the walls were made of stone and that there were markings carved into them, symbols. He couldn't reproduce them accurately, but he said they looked like letters from a language he didn't know. He said the keeper would trace the symbols with her fingers while she watched them, and that when she did, the air would change. He said it felt heavier, like being underwater. Catherine, under the same therapy, said less. But what she did say was more disturbing. She said the house wasn't always in the same place. She said sometimes she would look out the window, during the rare moments they were allowed upstairs, and the view would be different. Different trees, different sky. She said once, she looked out and saw nothing, just white, like the world outside had been erased. When Holloway asked her to clarify, she said she couldn't. She said she didn't have the words for it. She just knew that the house moved, or that they moved, or that something moved, and reality bent around them. In August, Leonard Voss presented his final report to Thomas Merrick. It was 63 pages long. Most of it was evidence and testimony, but the last 3 pages were Voss's personal conclusions, and they were damning. He wrote that in his professional opinion, the twins had not been held captive by a human being. He didn't speculate on what had taken them. He simply stated that the evidence, the physical evidence, the psychological evidence, and the testimony of the children themselves suggested an experience that defied conventional explanation. He noted the absence of any structure, the ritualistic arrangement of animal bones, the lack of physical aging in the children, the selective amnesia, the dissociation. He wrote that he believed something had happened to Samuel and Catherine Merrick in those woods, something that science couldn't measure and law enforcement couldn't investigate. He recommended the family seek long-term psychiatric care for the twins and consider relocating to a different town. Thomas read the report in his study. He locked it in a drawer. He never showed it to Anne, and he never spoke to Voss again. But that night, Thomas walked out to the woods. He went to the clearing where Samuel said the house had been, and he stood there in the dark, listening. Later, when asked by a neighbor why he'd gone, Thomas said he wanted to see if he could feel it, the wrongness, the thing his son had tried to describe. The neighbor asked him if he did. Thomas said yes. The family fractured slowly, like ice cracking under weight. By autumn of 1968, Thomas had stopped going to work. He'd been a foreman at a lumber mill, a steady job he'd held for 15 years, but after the twins returned, he couldn't focus. He'd stand at the cutting line and lose track of time, staring into the distance. His supervisor gave him leave. His co-workers stopped calling. Anne withdrew even further. She started talking to herself, whispering prayers under her breath, prayers from no denomination anyone recognized. She stopped cooking. She stopped cleaning. The house fell into disrepair, dishes piling up in the sink, dust gathering on every surface. The twins moved through it all like ghosts, silent and watchful. They didn't ask for anything. They didn't complain. They simply existed, occupying space without inhabiting it. Neighbors who'd once brought casseroles and offered help stopped visiting. The Merrick house became known as a place you didn't go. Children crossed the street to avoid walking past it, and the rumors, the ugly rumors, began to spread. Some said Anne had lost her mind. Others said Thomas had done something to those children during the years they were missing, that the whole story was a cover-up. The cruelest whispers suggested the twins had never really been gone at all, that they'd been hidden somewhere, abused, broken, and then returned when they were no longer recognizable. In October, exactly 11 years to the day after the twins first disappeared, something happened that forced the truth into the open. Catherine spoke, not in fragments, not in whispers. She spoke clearly, directly, for the first time since she'd returned. She was sitting at the kitchen table with Anne, picking at a piece of bread she hadn't eaten, when she looked up and said, "We weren't supposed to come back." Anne froze. She asked Catherine what she meant. Catherine said, "The keeper told us we couldn't leave. She said if we did, the door would stay open. She said something would follow us." Anne asked what would follow them. Catherine looked at her mother with those empty, unblinking eyes and said, "She did." That night, Anne called Dr. Holloway. She told him what Catherine had said. Holloway arrived the next morning and conducted an emergency session with both twins. He asked Catherine to explain what she'd meant. She refused. She said she wasn't allowed to talk about it anymore. Samuel, however, was willing. He said the keeper had given them a choice the night before they left. He said she'd told them they could go home, but that if they did, she would come with them, not in body, in something else. He said she would live in the spaces they didn't look, the corners of rooms, the gaps under doors, the silence between words. He said she'd already started. He said he could feel her in the house, watching, waiting. Holloway asked if the keeper had hurt them. Samuel said no. He said she'd kept them safe. He said she'd loved them. But he said her love was the kind that hollowed you out and filled you with something that wasn't yours. Holloway ended the session early. In his notes, he wrote that he no longer believed the children were fabricating their story. He wrote that they believed, with absolute conviction, that something had followed them home. And he wrote that after spending time in that house, he wasn't sure they were wrong. Things began happening. Small things. Objects would move when no one was looking. Doors would open on their own. The temperature in certain rooms would drop without explanation. Anne found footprints in the dust on the floor. Small footprints, child-sized, leading from the twins' bedroom to the cellar door. But neither Samuel nor Catherine had left their room that night. Thomas heard voices, whispers. He couldn't make out the words, but he heard them in the walls, in the pipes, in the spaces between floorboards. He started sleeping in his truck. Anne refused to leave. She said she had to protect her children, even though she was no longer sure what her children had become. On November 3rd, 1968, Anne Merrick called the sheriff's department and told them she wanted the twins removed from her home. She said they weren't safe. The dispatcher asked if the children were in danger. Anne said no. She said the children were the danger. 2 deputies arrived within the hour. They found Anne standing in the front yard, shaking, her hands clenched into fists. She told them the twins were inside. She told them not to look them directly in the eyes. She told them that if they heard whispers, they should leave immediately. The deputies thought she'd had a breakdown. They went inside. They found Samuel and Catherine sitting on the floor of the living room, hands folded in their laps, staring at the wall. The deputies asked if they were okay. Samuel turned his head slowly and smiled. It was the first time anyone had seen him smile since he'd returned. He said they were fine. He said they were waiting. The deputies asked what they were waiting for. Samuel's smile widened. The twins were placed in a state psychiatric facility in Charleston on November 5, 1968. Anne Merrick signed the commitment papers herself. Thomas didn't attend. He'd left 3 days earlier and never came back. His truck was found abandoned on a logging road 20 miles north of Hollowridge, keys still in the ignition, driver's door open. A search was conducted. They found his wallet, his coat, and a single shoe. No body, no blood, no sign of struggle. The case was ruled a probable suicide, though no one could explain where he'd gone or why. Anne remained in the house alone for 6 months. She rarely ate. She rarely slept. Neighbors would see her standing in the windows at odd hours. just staring out into the dark. In April of 1969, she hanged herself in the twins' bedroom. The suicide note was brief. It said, "They're still here. They never left. I can hear them in the walls." The house was sold at auction later that year. It's been through 7 owners since. None of them stayed longer than 2 years. Most reported the same things: cold spots, whispers, the feeling of being watched. The current owner, a man who bought the property in 2014, refused to comment when contacted for this story. But public records show he hasn't lived there since 2016. The house sits empty now, windows boarded, yard overgrown. The people of Hollowridge avoid it. They don't talk about it. And they certainly don't talk about the twins. Samuel and Catherine Merrick spent 17 years in the psychiatric facility. During that time, they barely spoke. Doctors tried medication, therapy, electroshock treatment. Nothing worked. They remained emotionally flat, unresponsive, distant. In 1985, when they turned 34 years old, though they still looked no older than their early teens, the state deemed them stable enough for supervised release. They were transferred to a group home in Morgantown. 3 weeks later, they disappeared. No one saw them leave. No one heard them go. Security footage from the facility showed their bedroom door opening at 2:17 in the morning, but no one walked out. The door simply opened, and then, hours later, it closed. The beds were empty. Their belongings were untouched. A search was conducted, but it was half-hearted at best. The staff didn't want to find them, and in truth, no one really looked. The case was filed as a voluntary disappearance and quietly forgotten, but there were sightings. Over the years, people claimed to see them. A gas station attendant in Kentucky said 2 children matching their description came in late one night, barefoot, wearing clothes that looked homemade. They didn't speak. They just stared at him until he looked away, and when he looked back, they were gone. A hiker in Tennessee reported seeing 2 figures standing motionless in the woods, watching him from a distance. He said they didn't move for 10 minutes, and when he tried to approach them, they turned and walked into the trees, vanishing without sound. A truck driver in Ohio said he picked up 2 hitchhikers on a foggy morning, a boy and a girl, who didn't say a word the entire ride. He said when he dropped them off, they walked toward a forest that wasn't on any map. He said he watched them until they disappeared into the fog, and that just before they vanished, the girl turned back and waved. He said her smile looked wrong, like it didn't belong on a human face. The official records say the Hollowridge twins are still missing. The case is cold. No active investigation, no new leads. But the evidence, the real evidence, tells a different story. It tells a story of 2 children who walked into the woods in 1957 and something else walked out in 1968. It tells a story of a woman named Evelyn Marsh, who may or may not have existed, who may or may not have been human, and who may or may not still be out there, waiting for the next children to wander too far from home. The house Samuel described was never found. The keeper was never identified, and the question that haunted Ann Merrick until the day she died remains unanswered. If the twins who came back weren't the same ones who disappeared, then what happened to the real Samuel and Catherine? Are they still out there, somewhere in those woods, trapped in a place that doesn't exist on any map? Or did they become something else entirely? Something that wears the shape of children but isn't, something that walks the back roads of America, hollow and patient and waiting. The truth is, we don't know. We'll never know. But every now and then, someone reports seeing 2 children by the side of the road, barefoot, silent, watching. And when people stop to help, when they ask if the children are lost, the children always say the same thing. They say they're trying to get home, and then they smile. And the people who stop, the ones who offer them a ride, they never talk about it afterward. But if you ask them, if you really press, they'll tell you one thing. They'll tell you the children's eyes were empty, like there was nothing behind them, like they were looking at you from somewhere far away, somewhere you were never meant to see. The Hollowridge twins are still out there. Maybe they're looking for home, or maybe home is looking for them. Either way, if you see 2 children standing alone on a dark road, barefoot and still, don't stop. Don't look too long, because the keeper keeps what she takes, and what comes back is never the same.